So essentially what I wanted to do here was to really go back to this point about the brick wall that Jo was talking about in her opening session, really the limitations that we find when we're trying to work with the kind of health-focused emphasis of controlled drugs. So the way that I wanted to do this very quickly, I'm going to try and take you up to the hour with this, was by looking at the international nature of the drug control system, because I think people tend to be very confused when we talk about drug policy reform in the UK. We're very limited in what we can actually do because we're bound into an international system. All countries are. It doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Russia, whether you're sitting in France, whether you're sitting in Mexico, we're all part of the same international treaty framework. So I want to very quickly show you the international treaty framework and how that is such a huge obstacle to the kinds of changes that we want to see happening to enable these kind of psychedelic therapeutic medicines. But the other thing that I also want to highlight is how the UK is itself probably an excellent case study of the contradictions and the hypocrisy of this system. Now, all of this goes back over 100 years. The beginnings of international drug control date right back to the 1880s, 1890s, the beginning of mobilization around what, at that point in time, was a global free trade in substances such as opiates from the opium poppy, heroin, coca, its derivative cocaine, and cannabis. And we have these countries, these states coming together. This was a very, very important, monumental meeting, really, the 1909 Shanghai Conference, at which countries began to try and create a framework for regulating what today we call narcotics. What they were trying to do at the time was incredibly benign, because, as I said, this was a very weakly regulated market. You know, this was a point where we didn't have professional medicine, we didn't really have professionalized pharmacy, we had reliance on what was available in grocery stores. So you can see here that we have, you know, Vatican-sponsored cocaine wine, cocaine toothache drops, heroin being freely available, and cannabis being freely available. And this was causing, you know, pretty significant concern. And what the international community tried to do in 1909 was to build a system. And the aim of this system, and what we call the international treaty framework, was to overcome what's called the dual use dilemma. And this dual use dilemma is that we have substances, naturally occurring substances, which have enormous value in medicine and in science. But the problem is that these overwhelmingly plant-based substances are also liable to misuse. And if there was one thing the kind of moderate temperance prohibition movements, which was so dominant in international drug lobbying at this time, did not want to see happening, was people having recreation or pleasure or fun, really, of any kind whatsoever. So what the international system did was to create this kind of bifurcation. On the one hand, ensuring that the global community, everybody around the world, had access to essential medicines, particularly opioid analgesics, in the opium poppy, which is this picture here. And then all of the countries around the world agree that they will limit the cultivation and the manufacture of these plants and derivative drugs to strictly authorized medical and scientific use only. And they will, and Jo mentioned this before, all these kind of narcotic substances, we call them drugs. They weren't known as drugs for the previous millennia, but these substances were then all scheduled by a ranking of harm developed in the 1930s. So what we're creating here, and this is very, very important to understand the limitations we face in research, is a system that aims to enable you to have access to the drugs you need for your medical requirements, but to completely prohibit any form of recreational use of these substances. These substances are criminalized if they're not authorized. And the big emphasis, I would argue, in the treaties, but particularly in terms of how then nation states, national governments have kind of rolled out these treaties, the emphasis has been on exemplary punitive punishment for non-authorized, non-sanctioned illicit drug use. So what we have is this international framework, starting with the 1912 Opium Convention, building up during the interwar period, and then in the post-war period, this series of further conventions overseen by the United Nations. The 1961 Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs is seen as being the most important because this introduces criminalization of the cultivation, the manufacture, the supply, the distribution, and the possession of this list of controlled drugs. And then also here, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances, extending this through to synthetic drugs in 1971 and coming into effect in 1976. Now, the problem with this series of conventions, I would argue, and why we're in quite the mess we are, is that what we have for the last 120 years nearly is the international community and national governments in terms of drug policy essentially layering onto the founding assumptions, the founding preoccupations and biases of nation states and lobby movements in the early 1900s. And the key aspects of this preoccupation and how we see this real bias in the international control system is that there is an over-focus on plant-based drugs in the system, okay? And these are overwhelmingly plant-based drugs which are cultivated in what we know today as the Global South. So a real focus on controlling opium poppy, coca, cocaine, and cannabis. And this preoccupation legitimizes the intervention of states in the affairs of other countries in order to eradicate and eliminate the cultivation of these plants. What we also see in the conventions is leniency towards pharmaceutical man-made synthetic drugs. This is because in the 1920s and the 30s, when the system was evolving, pharmaceutical lobbies in the global north were very effective in ensuring that they had enough latitude for experimentation and weren't kind of hammered down into this repressive system into which opium poppy, coca, and cannabis were placed. The real emphasis of the system here is that drug control is a law and order matter, not something to do with public health. And as a result of this, it's the police, it's not doctors, it's security actors, it's not civil society organizations who are the key actors in international drug control. What we know from our kind of historiography of drug policy is that drug policy really, and I would argue this very strongly, has been a tool for controlling deviant groups, ideological challenges. It's a tool for maintaining racial inequality. It's a tool for maintaining inequities between the global south and the global north. My particular focus of concern and most recent book is that it's also a tool for maintaining patriarchy and profound gendered inequalities. So we tend to associate, in the way that drug norms are inculcated in our societies over the last 120 years, was by identifying certain types of drugs with specific types of deviant groups. And this is where, as Jo mentioned in her talk, we see LSD and MDMA being brought into this system, because this deviance is associated with the anti-war movement, with hippies, with radical challenges to the intellectual and ideological foundations of capitalist and also, I'd argue, patriarchal societies. So trying to kind of demonstrate to you that kind of differentiation here, what you see this advert from the 1940s, stay fit, stay slim, take amphetamines. So it was completely acceptable for the marketing of these types of substances because of the nature of the international treaty framework that evolved. But at the same time, the types of advertisements and propaganda we were seeing about cannabis was very much emphasizing that this is a demon drug, that this is a foundation drug that will lead you into a life of immorality, depravity, and vice. So this completely different way of dealing with the drugs. Now, the problem is that international drug control has failed. It's not controversial to say anymore that this model has failed. It's failed on both counts. If we say that the aim of international drug control is to enable access to medicines and to ensure that the international system upholds our right to health and our right to the best treatment, it's failed on that level. Why has it failed? Well, despite this effort to kind of delineate between the legal markets and the illicit markets, this system blocks vital medical research. For the point that Jo made before, it's the schedule of controls. We have very, very robust reporting requirements. If you want to hold stocks of these medicines, then you have to have the approval of the Home Office. There are very, very strict reporting requirements. The conditions in which you hold these medicines, if you're wanting to carry out clinical trials, is a real impediment to their rollout. And what this has meant is that not only do we have limitations in terms of drugs such as psychedelic medicines, it means that the basics, World Health Organization recognized essential medicines such as opioid analgesics, are not available to the majority of the world's population. Control and consumption of legal opiates is completely concentrated in the wealthy countries of the global north. This model, I'll come back to the failures. I could carry on talking about failures of drug policy for decades, really, but just really trying to focus this down. The other way this system has failed, it's not only failed in order to give us access to medicine, it's also failed to control illicit markets, even though this has been the preoccupation. We're currently at a situation where we have the highest ever levels of coca and opium poppy being cultivated in places like Afghanistan and Colombia. There's been no reduction in total volumes of drugs. This is despite the amount of punishment, the draconian punishments that are meted out in this system, very, very repressive system. We've seen a huge increase in levels of incarceration in the 1980s, 1990s, and into the 2000s. mainly as a result of the final treaty in the convention, which is really emphasizing this kind of penalization, carcerarization approach in drug policy. But it doesn't matter how many people we incarcerate, this is not reducing the amount of controlled drugs being produced, manufactured, trafficked, and consumed. Those levels of consumption globally, this is past annual use, and you'll see, cannabis continues to be a global habit. If you look at this here, the amphetamines, the MDMA, I mean, this is, as I said, a global habit in terms of drug use. So this system's failed on both sides. Let me very quickly just focus down on the UK and the profundity of the failures of the United Kingdom. And now, when I've been watching so many of these kind of COVID briefings, we've had the Union Jack in the background. So I feel that I should also transpose the Union Jack here to emphasize the kind of British role and position here. When we're talking about the UK, we're talking about a country which is the world's largest exporter of pharmaceutical heroin. We're allowed to do that. We're allowed to cultivate opium poppy in this country because the UK falls under the licit authorized. So we can destroy opium poppy in Afghanistan, but we can cultivate it in the UK because this is legal, that's illicit. The UK is also the largest re-exporter of pharmaceutical cocaine, the largest exporter of pharmaceutical cannabis, and we're also the largest manufacturer of oxycodone, synthetic opiate. We also have a booming biotech industry in this country. February the 3rd, there was this really interesting development, which was the sale of GW Pharmaceuticals, which is a Cambridge-based biotechnology company, was sold to Jazz Pharmaceuticals, and this was for over $7 billion. This was the largest transaction in terms of a British pharmaceutical. And what was interesting here is that GW, the reason why they were so, easily, well, not easily, but so hotly pursued and wanted and lapped up by pharmaceutical companies such as Jazz, is that they have two drugs which are based on most advanced cannabinoid science, but in particular, Epidiolex, which here, and Joe was talking about this before, which is used in the treatment of this very, very severe epilepsy, Lennox-Gastaut and Dravet syndrome, and tuberous sclerosis. And so this kind of treatment, Epidiolex, which is based on cannabinoid science, it's based on cannabis, not incorporating the THC, a predominantly the psychoactive element, a predominantly CBD-based medicine. And this is what is making GW so lucrative and so hotly pursued in terms of international pharmaceuticals, because these drugs are now being widely dispersed for medical ailments, apart from the UK, as you'll see. So we have a very, very robust, excellent pharmaceutical sector. And the UK, in line with the international conventions, what we've tried to do is to then have this kind of pharmaceutical industry, but then really tough and robust regulation of the illicit market. The UK drug legislation is the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act. I've stuck a birthday cake there because it's the 50th anniversary of British drug laws. This is a scandal. There is a lot of mobilization right now around the 1971 anniversary, because many of us who believe in drug policy reform argue that it's absolutely unconscionable to us that this country has a drug law that is now over 50 years old. It's staggering that the international system is based on a model which is nearly 120 years old, but in this country, our primary drug legislation over 50 years old. So this is important because this is a time before globalization. It's before the advent of HIV/AIDS. It's when my mum still thought she was a groovy dancer. I mean, this is a very, very old framework that we're still using. And it's very tough. It's very robust. These are the schedules that Joe was talking about before. Schedule 1, LSD, MDMA, no therapeutic value, cannot be lawfully possessed. If you want to do research, you must have a Home Office license. Schedule 2 and 3, heroin and cannabis. Again, can be prescribed and legally possessed, but again, it's the policing of these substances which is particularly problematic. So that's our scheduling system, and you'll see the challenge that we have here in terms of psychedelic research because of the scheduling of these drugs following through from the international treaty system. But then let's just have a look here at the actual harms. And this is one of the points that Joe was making before, and it's very, very important here, is that we could very, very easily argue, and this is the work of Professor David Knott, that the classification of harm in our drug laws does not reflect the harms caused by these substances. Alcohol and tobacco aren't even classified under this because they're regulated and not controlled. And yet this relative harm demonstrates to us here that alcohol is the most problematic intoxicating substance. Look where LSD is, look where MDMA is. They're at completely the opposite end of the scale of harm. What's happening in our illicit markets, and this really demonstrates the travesty of the UK, we are one of Europe's biggest illicit, illegal, unauthorized drug use markets. British people spend more money on illicit drugs than they spend in Aldi, which would be quite a shock for anybody who knows the consumption habits of many British people. And what we know is that the British consumer market is larger than the European market. We have a thriving darknet market. Okay, we're actually exporting drugs through darknet drug markets. We have the highest levels of drug use in Europe. We've got the highest levels of cocaine use. And what we also have are the highest levels of drug-related death. One person in Scotland dies of a drug overdose every 8 hours. This is a scandal. So these kind of problems have impacted other countries, and they've all begun to embrace drug policy reform. You'll see here, Iceland most recently. Thailand has now kind of legalized medical marijuana from 2018. Oregon's decriminalized all personal drug use. And what we're doing in the UK is having debates which are so arcane, so behind the curve, so insulting in their lack of engagement with the facts, that right now in this country, it's really, really difficult to push forward momentum for change. The quality of the debate here is really quite a shambles. So while we're kind of talking in Parliament, while other countries are talking about health reforms and medical marijuana and changing their drug laws, we're still having this kind of narrative discussions here, which I would say are 20, 30 years old. So in terms of my conclusion here, what we need to see in the UK, go back to the statement of the House of Common Science and Technology Committee. They described our drug laws as arbitrary, unscientific, and based on historical assumptions, not science. We need evidence-based drug laws in this country, and we need these drug laws to be determined by the actual harms that drugs cause. I can't see any other way, and really would advocate for decriminalisation, because you're simply not going to remove the stigma, you're not going to remove the policing, you're not going to change the patterns of funding that we need to see happen in the UK for us to have more effective strategies to reduce the harm linked to drug use. We need better stakeholder engagement. It's very difficult to do when you criminalise people. We don't know how policies are working because people can't participate in these discussions because they're criminalised. And we need a public health focus. Grown-up conversations, as my slides before I hope to indicate, really show we're not having those grown-up conversations in this country. And while we very much welcome the kind of reforms and improvements in places like Portugal, Canada, the United States, we really have to have international level treaty reform. Unless we start changing the international drug conventions, we're going to be hugely, hugely contained in what we can actually do at national level. But my final slide on what I would really, really emphasize in the United Kingdom, I mean, apart from us having a mature drug debate, apart from us emphasizing the right to health, is that we have to move away from the hypocrisy of British drugs policy. And to be in a situation where we've had a Home Office minister who recused on questions around cannabis is deeply problematic, particularly when it's your own husband who is also one of the beneficiaries of a system that enables legal cultivation and legal drug production to prevail over a more effective regulation of the whole drug market. So thank you. There I go. I'll finish there.